Hello. Today we're going to start our unit on personality and leisure. I think many of you will find this quite interesting. Students usually quite like learning about this unit. First, we'll talk about the nature of personality and the dimensions of personality and their implications for leisure. We'll look at leisure research on personality. And then general personality traits that are studied in leisure research. And then leisure-specific personality dispositions. And finally, interactionism and a few issues of personality and leisure. So first, what is personality? Well, the definition of personality is a set of personal characteristics that make people unique. Simple as that. Identify people as being different from others. So, the nature of personality, then, is really the extent to which patterns of behavior are consistent and distant and reflective of an individual's personalities, meaning the manner in which a person acts varies across different situations often. But personality is usually enduring, so that means long-lasting patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior that are expressed in different circumstances. So we know that, for example, in certain settings, you might be more likely to show different aspects of your personality than in other situations. There's really the theory and research on personality look at two separate aspects of these sort of enduring patterns of ourselves. The first is structure of personality. So this is, how is personality viewed? We're looking at the organization of these enduring, long-lasting patterns of thought, feeling, and behavior. So when we're looking at the structure of personality, people look at things like, for example, stability versus change. How much of our personality remains stable or consistent across our lifespan versus how much do we change over time or even in different settings? They also look at integration versus conflict. So, sometimes you have, you might be in settings that conflict with your personality. People look at obviously patterns over time and things like private versus public world. For example, we might be more likely to show our personality, our true personalities, during leisure activities rather than perhaps at work or school settings. And the second aspect that we look at is really individual differences. So, how personality is viewed, the way that people are the same or different from one another. So, a lot of research has been done looking at grouping of personality factors and looking at what does it mean to be high or low on these different personality factors. So, for example, we'll talk about this in a moment, but many different types of personality characteristics or identities have been examined, yet we can maybe sometimes boil these all down to just a few key groupings to understand more about personality. So there's different theories on personality perspectives, really looking at how we actually acquire our personalities. Where does this come from? So we're going to be looking then, I'll explain the four different theories, which are psychodynamic, cognitive social, humanistic, and then trait theories. So personality really, I'm sure people have considered different personalities for a very long time, but it really only became a topic for research, really looking in the 30s with Sigmund Freud, who developed psychodynamic theory. And so he really believed that much of our behavior or our personality results from instincts and unconscious drives. So he thinks that, or he thought that personality was really influenced then by our sexuality, which he really emphasized, culture, biology, and childhood experiences. So a lot of Freud's work was really looking at especially childhood experiences, even during infancy. As I previously had mentioned in our last unit on age, um, Eric Erikson really criticized Freud for his focus on biology, on male and female and these sexual drives, whereas Erikson really viewed a lot of things as being social in nature. And nowadays we know the limitations and criticisms is that there was really lack of scientific research on this theory and very difficult to prove. This had a lot to do with dreams and subconsciousness and all this. A lot of people, as I said, overemphasis on sexual motivation. And also, people have criticized this theory for overemphasis on childhood experiences rather than on adult learning. However, this is an important theory in that it does emphasize that what happens in childhood can have long-lasting influences on your psychology. The second view of personality theory is the cognitive social theory by Bandura, which is a lot of this whole course is really based on social cognitive theory. And Bandura really viewed that personality then really comes from learning rather than conflict or defense or instinct. It's the basis of our personality, and that personality dispositions are relatively specific and shaped by consequences. So he really looked at that, what influences personality then is really our beliefs, our expectations, and how we process information. And that, and this is also assuming that people consciously know what they want, though. And he's also really looking at the relationship between environmental demands and why someone processes information about the self and the world. Remember, Bandura is really social cognitive theory is looking at both the environment and the individual and their interrelationship among each other. And I could see this. For example, my personality is very much my father, and my mother always laughs because she said when I was younger, when I was a child, my father was in university and writing exams and things and was working, and he worked very many long hours, so obviously I spent more time with my mother. So Freud's theory, psychodynamic, would say, it's biological, so maybe I inherited the personality traits. Whereas my mom thought it should be social cognitive theory, saying since she did the most teaching of me, I should be more like her. But and ended up being more genetic. Of course, there's limitations and criticisms of cognitive social theory, such as I already mentioned, this overemphasis on the rational side of life or of humans. And actually, there's a lot more research now saying that maybe Freud was maybe it wasn't so much about sexual behavior, but that maybe we actually most of our behavior might be unconscious and we're not really thinking of things as much as we think, that maybe we're not rational as much. And people also criticized this theory for overemphasis on emotion, motivation, and irrationality. The next theory that really came was by Maslow and Rogers, and these are grouped as the humanistic theories of personality. So here they're looking at the focus on the way people deal with fundamental human concerns, like mortality and meaning of life, wisdom, the large philosophical things. So they think that in this case, what influences personality is a lot to do with our free will. This group of theories says that it's not environmental or genetic factors that determine behavior, but it is that we as individuals strive for self through expression, development, and growth. Now, I don't have criticisms of this theory, but obviously this theory has been criticized for, being overemphasis on like this view that humans are always striving for self-actualization, and obviously it's not emphasizing the environment or social factors or genetic either. So this is kind of the least likely used theory these days, and that's because in part it is philosophical in nature. And finally is trait theory, and this was by Allport in the 50s. So he was really looking then at that there's everyone has certain traits. And what is a trait? It is an emotional, motivational, cognitive, and behavioral tendency that constitute underlying dimensions of personality, and on which people vary then. So and in this case, what influences personality then are traits. So traits can be observed tendencies to behave in a particular way, or like an underlying personality disposition that generates a behavioral tendency, meaning that if you have a specific kind of personality trait, then you might be more likely to do and initiate certain behaviors. And I just want to emphasize that this theory, trait theory, is the most used theory when we study how personality and leisure are related. That might be important for, an important question on quiz exams. So here, trait theory is simply this. We have specific traits. It influences our behavior, and our behavior, though, might also impact our personality eventually, where it's more of a reciprocal relationship. And obviously, then, this is saying that we have specific traits or underlying ways that then influence the leisure activities that we will choose. And could be in some ways, maybe the leisure activities we choose also kind of influences our personality, especially as we're in childhood and adolescence. So next we'll talk about the dimensions of personality. So their implications for leisure. We'll talk about the big 5 personality traits, and then where personality traits maybe come from. We talked about those theories, but there's other ways of looking at it. So we know that leisure can be a context for self-expression. It is in our leisure where an individual is most likely to feel like his or her true self. In leisure, here's a quote I really like by Samdell. The opportunity to be truly self-expressive and accepted for who you really are may be one factor that makes informal social interaction an important leisure context. So it might be more that in our leisure we can really see how people might be. And I don't know if you've had this experience. You might have a peer in class or something, and they seem quite quiet, or maybe not very social in nature, but then you see them outside of the school context in a leisure setting, and maybe they're quite gregarious and talkative. And maybe that's their true personality, but they just don't feel they can express that in, let's say, a work or school setting, um, or, I know people always think of, I've had people mention to me, they always thought I was kind of librarian like until they, see me in a social situation and realize that, I'm not, um, I'm, quite not as librarian like as they think, or innocent, I guess. So we know then that uh, traits are more important when the social situation is familiar and informal, or private versus novel, or formal and public. So meaning like that when um when you're in a social situation that is more um familiar and informal, you're more likely to show yourself, your true personality, than if it was like a formal and public setting. And also, traits are also important when instructions are non existent or general versus detailed and complete. For example, if you're in a very structured recreation and leisure activity that says you do this and you do this and you do this, that doesn't provide you with opportunity for self expression or personality as much as when, is kind of an informal or, laissez faire kind of setting. And again, this relates to choice. So we think that personality traits are going to be more evident when someone has choice versus when there's little perceived control or choice. So this means that personality traits are more likely to be influential in casual situations in comparison to other situations where there are clear demands and expectations, like work and school settings. Again, leisure activities are more likely where we get to express our true selves. So, I'm going to talk about the big 5 personality traits. For each of these, I'll explain what the trait is, what it means to be low or high on it, and then also what's most important in this unit is, you need to understand each of these personality traits, but then how does that influence leisure behavior or leisure choices? So the big 5 are extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness. I always tell students, a really great acronym to remember this is OCEAN. OCEAN. OCEAN gives you the big 5. So first is extroversion, and this is you probably hear about extroverts and introverts the most. This is kind of a common language that we even use in our everyday speech, even. And I want to point out that technically on all of these traits are either high or low. I don't really have it here, but we have extroverts and introverts. Technically, in personality research, no one is introverted. You're either high or low on extroversion. If that makes sense. But in this case, I'm going to say introvert because we that's just the language we use. So an extrovert is often very assertive, meaning that they are not aggressive, but they're not passive. They're in the middle. So assertive. They often have gregariousness. So that means, being like excited, laughing a lot, that kind of thing, outgoing. People who are high on extrovert are excitement seeking and often kind of show like they're what's viewed as positive emotionality. So, just general happiness for life. And now, obviously, we often group people as extroverts or introverts, but I think you can kind of be might change on this. Like, for example, I'm very much an extrovert, but I also think that as I'm aging, I'm becoming more an introvert in certain social situations. So, an extrovert then engages in more intense activities and also high levels of stimulation. So, they just engage in everything more intense. Often, then, they seek an element of risk. So, generally, research has shown that athletes, for example, are higher on extroversion than introversion. Extroverts might also like travel, like unstructured and exotic travel, um, adventure travel, sensation seeking, so things that is adventurous, intense, and a greater variety of activities. And now we often think of extroverts as like the as being social, about social interaction, but that's not really true. Like an introvert does not mean that you're shy. Um, but it's just about having a low threshold of arousal. So introverts, they just have less optimal, their threshold for optimal level of arousal might be lower. They have less stimulation to stay at this optimal level and prefer then less sensations. So, for example, some research has shown that introverts might be more likely to do like computer games or fantasy games, um, be more into familiar leisure rather than novel. For example, travel to familiar places. And they're low on sensation seeking. So it's just, again, about more familiar leisure activities, not maybe doing new things. Next is agreeableness. So agreeableness means that it's about trust and straightforwardness and altruism. So obviously, being a trustful person, um, and being straightforward. So this kind of you can see that has a lot to do with kind of morals in a way. And altruistic, meaning very much altruism means about wanting to help people, like truly as part of your personality. So, in contrast, someone who's not agreeable might be more hostile or indifferent or also maybe self centered. So, people with high agreeableness are very social. And you can see like altruism. So, that means they really want people with high agreeableness will look for social aspects of leisure. And also, if they're altruistic, they're into helping. So, people with this personality trait high on it will be looking at volunteer work, maybe coaching, teaching, recreation, or sport. So it's a lot of a helping role and making a difference in people's lives. Where someone who is low in agreeableness um, might have view leisure more as not as a place to give to others or be altruistic, but as an opportunity for self-indulgence and escape. So they might be, more likely, well, just to do personal activities or self-indulgent means like, maybe treating yourself to something or a leisure activity, um, or, pampering yourself or just doing something because you enjoy it. Then we have conscientiousness. So, we can think if I think of, what's a conscientious person? Well, they often have order, dutifulness, like I feel a sense of duty. They're often very achievement striving and have high self discipline and, deliberation, meaning very goal oriented. So, people who are very high on conscientiousness, well, they are very organized, responsible, reliable people. And uh, so that means that they often really enjoy goal orientation and work type of activities or serious leisure. So people who are high on conscientiousness are more likely to do serious leisure and high investment, to really like things where there is a high commitment and involvement in that activity. But people who are high on conscientiousness do also have difficulty being spontaneous. You know, um, having just kind of not doing something that's planned. In contrast, someone who is low on conscientiousness is often impulsive. They might seek immediate gratification and they are spontaneous. They see something, an opportunity, and just, do it. And for example, I'm very much high conscientiousness. My husband is low conscientiousness, and this, has been interesting in our lives with each other when it comes to leisure. You know, um, for example, you know, my husband, we might be driving, and then he's like, "Oh, look, there's like a pond. Let's just like go to the watering hole there, jump in." Um, to me, I would find that, it would be very difficult to be spontaneous. Like, well, we hadn't planned the activity. Do I have all the equipment I need, etc.? Um, whereas, he would just see something and just do it and like change our whole plans for it, which, both have its benefits. Um, so now, I guess in our marriage, we're more that I'm the one who organizes and he's the one that is the more spontaneous. But now I just always have, you got to always have a towel and a bathing suit with you at all times in the car so I'm prepared to be spontaneous. Next is neuroticism. And I want to just make sure people don't confuse this with narcissism. Narcissism is like when you think you're, from the Greek myth where you're staring in the reflection of the water, and he was thinking he was so handsome to the point that he fell in and drowned. It's one of the Greek myths. So it's, about being narcissistic is when you're, just think you're totally awesome. And it's related to some psychopathic tendencies more. But neuroticism is different. Neuroticism is when the traits are being more like having high anxiety. People might have more hostility and depression, as well as self-consciousness. And in this case, people with high neuroticism then, they often have difficulty achieving in-depth involvement because that's necessary for enjoyment. And it's actually it's a psychopathological condition. They call it anhedonia, which means the inability to experience pleasure. And I guess in a way, if you look at it more, it's more about, as it says here, the tendency to discount the positives in one's life. So I guess a good way of thinking about this is being high on neuroticism. It's just generally sort of a view of life as like it being the glass half full rather than, or sorry, half empty, pardon me, than being half full. So this is in a way difficult. We have to think then if people are high on this, it means that they might have difficulty experiencing leisure, difficulty enjoying, relaxing, because they're always feeling self-conscious and anxious. Whereas research has shown that people who are low on neuroticism are people then who very much are seeking pleasure, and it's often people who are doing risk taking and adventure. So people who are athletes, skiers, scuba divers. Research has shown that they usually have low levels of this trait. And the last part of the big five is openness. So the traits for openness are aesthetic sensitivity, meaning aesthetic, meaning you can you're sensitive to taste, touch, sights, sounds, etc., like all of your senses. Okay. Also, a need for variety and often having unconventional values, like as the trait says, like you're open to trying new things. So people with high openness are usually are open to new ideas, thoughts, and cultural interest. So they might be more likely, for example, to read, go and do learning classes, participate in these kind of high culture activities like, I don't know, operas and going to the international food festival or whatever. So an education aptitude, meaning that they like learning and they often want to learn in their leisure activities. Because of this sentience, this wanting to use their senses, they might be like high on being an outdoor recreation person, or perhaps artistic and cultural pursuits. And research has shown that they often have more non-work friendships, which often enhances life satisfaction in later life. So there's a link on the course Shell looking at the Big Five personality traits self-test. You can do that. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but these personality traits and other similar tools are even used in job applications. I have had times applying to a job when had to do a personality test. The Marks-Briggs personality test is often used in business settings. I know my husband, when he was applying for insurance companies, uh, he had to do a personality test, and I guess because I'm not exactly sure what they're looking for in these, but they're, I guess, looking for someone who's going to get along with their team. So this is just the picture you see here is really a distribution of people's scores on this test, looking at, how many people are extroverts, neurotic, agreeable, conscientious, and open. And you can see here, you can see in kind of, what your percentile is, along with the more of the people who are doing it. So here this is my score. So, I had a very high score on extroversion. My conscientiousness was also fairly high. I was low on neuroticism, pretty high on agreeableness, and in the middle for, openness, I guess. So I encourage you, just for fun even, to go and do that Big Five personality trait. And as I said, it's also kind of important for thinking about with job applications, because sometimes these are things that people are looking for. So next, we're going to talk about where personality traits come from. Obviously, they can be genetic or learned. And learned would be like the environmental conditions, response to our social world, to the rewards and punishments we receive through socialization. So, is it genetic or is it learned? So, more in current research, how do we know whether traits are determined by genetics or early childhood experiences? How do people actually start studying this? Well, I will say a lot of this was done way before research ethics. That's how. So they looked at twin studies. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there are reports of twins actually being separated at birth, like especially if twins were born in like an adoptive setting, foster care, and researchers like purposely separated them in order to study. So that's why it was unethical. Now, obviously, today people don't look at it that way. But what they're really looking at is that you have identical twins, so monozygotic, and that means that they came from, the same egg. Okay, so they are genetically identical. In comparison, you've got fraternal twins, who means that, obviously, they're born at the same time, but they are not genetically the same. So therefore, when you look at twins, you can see how much comes from genetics versus how much from socialization. And so what they have looked at is they've looked at identical twins who are reared, meaning brought up, um, from apart from, in different households versus those who were reared in the same, raised in the same household. So I've got my one house there on the top left. So you've got identical twins born in the same house. And then they compared that to identical twins who were raised in separate households. And, for example, that could be divorce, when the mother has one child and the father has the other, for example. And then they also looked at what about fraternal twins raised in the same household versus being raised in separate households. And so this way they can really see how much is it genetic and how much is environment. And they then were actually found that more than 50%, it was about half and half, about 50% of our personality is attributed to genetics, and a lot of research shows the other 50% is attributed to our the way our social environment and how we have been socialized. There are then there's some, obviously leisure research on personality. So in leisure research, we often look at how we measure personality traits. So in this case, we look at, usually it is a survey that is used, like a paper and pencil test. And we also should ask ourselves, why do we focus on personality traits? Well, it obviously is because if we understand people's personality and how it relates to their leisure choices, it allows us to target market. You know, obviously, as a leisure researcher myself, I'm looking at this more to understand the psychology of it. But this has implications then for, industry to be able to target certain people. For example, someone who is running a adventure outdoor recreation knows that it's better to be targeting people who are, like, for example, high on extroversion, or maybe openness. So there are several personality traits. Generally, there's different personality traits that are studied in leisure, and they are locus of control, attentional style, type A behavior profile, playfulness, shyness, and autotelic personality. And so next class, we're going to then be looking at these different personality traits, and then we'll next be focusing on some of the leisure specific personality traits, that leisure researchers have specifically developed and researched. So I'm going to end it there for today, and next we'll focusing then more on specifically on these traits and how they influence leisure.